The Beatles, for young men from Liverpool, changed the world of music forever. With just 3 chords and pure creativity, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr made songs that touched millions of hearts. Hits like Let It Be, Hey Jude, and Yesterday were more than songs. They were emotional experiences. People laughed, cried, and felt understood through their music. The world saw only their brilliance, their energy, and their ability to connect with millions. But behind the lights, cheers, and applause, a different story unfolded. Inside, the Beatles were struggling with exhaustion, disagreements, and the pressures of fame. Each member was dealing with personal challenges, and small conflict began to grow into serious tensions. While fans believed in the unity of the band, the truth was far more complicated. For decades, many wondered what really caused the Beatles' breakup. Rumors, stories, and theories have circulated for over 50 years. Some blame creative differences, others blame business issues, and some even blame personal struggles. But at 84, Ringo Starr finally spoke openly about what he believes led to the end of the Beatles, and his account brings shocking details to light. According to Ringo, one person played a crucial role in changing the dynamics of the band. Yoko Ono, John Lennon's partner. Through her influence, she disrupted the harmony, introduced new habits, and altered John in ways that ultimately affected the entire group. For fans, this revelation is both fascinating and heartbreaking. It is a story not just about fame and music, but about trust, loyalty, and how personal relationships can deeply affect even the greatest of artistic collaborations. The Beatles story is not just about songs. It is a human story about friendship, love, and the struggles that come with extraordinary talent. In this article, we will explore Ringo Starr's account, the rise of tensions in the band, and how the arrival of Yoko Ono marked a turning point in one of the most legendary stories in music history. In 1968, a cold and gray afternoon in London, John Lennon arrived at Ringo Starr's house with a woman who would later change the course of the Beatles' history. This woman was Yoko Ono, a Japanese artist whose appearance and personality immediately struck Ringo as unusual. She had messy black hair, deep, inscrutable eyes, and an aura that made it clear she did not fit into the ordinary world around her. Ringo, who was making tea in the kitchen, initially assumed it was a normal visit, but what he saw in the living room shocked him. Yoko began rummaging through his personal notebooks as if she had lived there for years, speaking casually while examining his private belongings. John introduced her as a conceptual artist, but Ringo could sense something more, an energy that was unusual, commanding, and difficult to interpret. What made the situation even stranger was a closeness between John and Yoko. They held hands tightly under the table, and John, with a cold and emotionless expression, ignored Ringo's obvious concern. Ringo realized that John was under the influence of a new and intense attachment. Over the next few days, Ringo tried to warn John about potential dangers, explaining that this obsession might distract him from the band and his responsibilities. But John, enthralled by Yoko, dismissed Ringo's advice, claiming that she was his new muse and inspiration. Ringo watched helplessly as the man he had shared stages, laughter, and victories became increasingly consumed by this new relationship. The intensity of John and Yoko's bond was unlike anything Ringo had seen before. This was not just a romantic relationship. It was a complete reordering of priorities and attention. Ringo knew that the arrival of Yoko was not simply a personal matter, but would have consequences for the entire band. Her influence on John, both emotionally and creatively, was growing stronger each day, and Ringo feared the impact it would have on the unity of the Beatles. Soon after Yoko's arrival, the dynamics of the Beatles began to change. The band, which had been known for its harmony, collaboration, and unique creative energy, started to feel tension that could not be ignored. John's behavior became erratic, and he often showed signs of distraction, arriving late to recording sessions or appearing disengaged during rehearsals. Ringo, Paul, and George noticed that John was no longer the same man. He was constantly influenced by Yoko's opinions, and seemed to measure his actions based on her reactions. The presence of Yoko in the studio, previously a sacred space for the 4 Beatles to create music in privacy, was considered almost taboo. The Beatles had an unwritten rule. No outsiders were allowed in the studio during recording sessions. Yet, John invited Yoko without hesitation, allowing her to observe, comment, and even influence creative decisions. For Ringo and the others, This was unsettling. Paul tried to focus on his work. George tried to maintain a professional attitude, and Ringo observed quietly, recognizing the growing danger to the band's cohesion. The energy in the studio shifted from one of collaboration to tension. Arguments became frequent, and the once fluid communication between the members began to break down. Ringo noticed that John's creativity, which had been a driving force in the Beatles' success, was now entwined with Yoko's guidance. She pushed him to experiment with new ideas, expand his consciousness, and explore avant-garde artistic expressions. While innovation is often positive, the speed and intensity with which John embraced these changes created a chaotic environment. The once strong rhythm of the Beatles' work was disrupted, leaving Paul and George frustrated, and Ringo increasingly concerned. What had started as personal attachment had now begun to interfere directly with the music and the creative harmony that had defined the Beatles. Tension grew day by day, and the early signs of collapse became impossible to ignore. John Lennon's transformation during this period was dramatic. Influenced by Yoko, he began experimenting with substances that altered his focus, energy, and emotional state. Ringo observed John entering the studio with bloodshot eyes, yawning frequently, and appearing disconnected from the creative process. His presence no longer inspired collaboration. Instead, it disrupted the workflow. Producers, like George Martin, tried to manage the situation, often raising their voices in frustration when John failed to participate effectively. Arguments became heated, and the band's unity started to unravel. John's behavior was no longer controlled by his desire to create music with his friends, but was now guided by Yoko's influence and his own artistic exploration. He became obsessed with avant-garde art, experimental music, and philosophical ideas promoted by Yoko. While some of these explorations were innovative, they often clashed with the practical needs of recording an album or maintaining the rhythm of collaboration among the four members. Ringo noticed that John's personal priorities were now dictated by a combination of emotional attachment and Yoko's artistic guidance. This created a separation within the band, John and Yoko on one side, exploring new artistic directions, and Paul, George, and Ringo on the other, trying to preserve the essence of the Beatles. This separation was not only emotional, but practical. Recording sessions were disrupted. Creative decisions became contentious, and each song became a battleground of conflicting priorities. The Beatles were no longer working as a single unit. They were fragments trying to function together under enormous strain. The situation Ringo witnessed would eventually lead to the famous rooftop performance, Abbey Road recordings, and ultimately the dissolution of the Beatles as a collaborative band. The stress, confusion, and emotional intensity of this period marked a turning point in one of music history's most celebrated stories. The Beatles, for young men from Liverpool, forever changed the world of music. John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr created songs that touched millions of hearts, from Let It Be to Hey Jude and Yesterday. These songs were more than melodies. They were lifelines for a generation, carrying emotions that resonated deeply with people around the world. The Beatles were not only musicians. They were cultural icons, inspiring fashion attitudes and even social change. But beneath the global fame and dazzling performances, tension simmered. The band's members faced exhaustion, creative differences, and personal struggles, which gradually grew into conflicts. Fans only saw the magic of the stage and the charm of interviews. But behind the scenes, the four men were often at odds with each other. For decades, people speculated about why such a tight-knit and talented group fell apart. Some blamed business pressures, others blamed creative disagreements, and a few even blamed individual personalities. Now, at 84, Ringo Starr has provided his side of the story, revealing the personal and emotional factors that contributed to the Beatles' disbanding. According to Ringo, one person had an unusually strong influence over the dynamics of the band, Yoko Ono. Her arrival changed John Lennon, disrupted the group's rhythm, and introduced tension that could not be ignored. Ringo's account sheds light on how personal relationships, emotional attachments, and outside influence can profoundly impact even the most successful and talented creative collaborations. For Beatles fans, this story is both shocking and heartbreaking. It's not merely a tale of musical success or failure. It's a deeply human story of friendship, love, and loyalty strained under the pressures of extraordinary fame. In 1968, John Lennon arrived at Ringo Starr's home on a cold London afternoon, bringing with him a Japanese artist named Yoko Ono. From the moment Ringo saw her, he sensed something extraordinary about Yoko. She had a presence that was impossible to ignore. Messy black hair, intense, unreadable eyes, and a calm yet commanding aura. Ringo, making tea in the kitchen, assumed it was a typical visit, but what he witnessed in the living room stunned him. Yoko began examining Ringo's personal notebooks with a nonchalance that suggested she did not respect boundaries in the usual way. John introduced her as a conceptual artist, but Ringo immediately noticed her influence over John. They held hands tightly under the table, and John, with a distant and emotionless gaze, seemed entirely absorbed by her presence. Ringo asked himself who this woman was and how she could have such a strong effect on John, who had always been the lively, unpredictable, and charming friend he knew. Over the following days, Ringo tried to warn John about the possible dangers of becoming completely absorbed in a new relationship, but John, enthralled by Yoko, dismissed the warnings. He insisted she was his muse, his inspiration, and Ringo could only watch helplessly as his friend's priorities began to shift. Ringo realized that Yoko's arrival was not just a personal matter. It had the potential to influence the whole band. Her presence marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would affect creativity, collaboration, and friendship in ways no one could have anticipated. The bond between John and Yoko was intense, almost inseparable, and it quickly became clear that her influence would extend into the Beatles' private world, including the studio where the magic of their music was created. Soon after Yoko's arrival, the dynamics within the Beatles began to shift. The band, long known for collaboration and creative synergy, started showing signs of strain. John's behavior changed. He became distracted, often arriving late or disengaged during rehearsals. Ringo, Paul, and George noticed that John no longer shared the same energy or commitment he once had. His actions seemed guided more by Yoko's opinions than by the needs of the band. The Beatles had a strict, unwritten rule. No outsiders were allowed in the studio during recording sessions. The studio was a sacred space, reserved for the four members to create, experiment, and perfect their craft without interruption. Yoko, however, was present in almost every session, observing, commenting, and sometimes influencing decisions. Ringo, Paul, and George were increasingly uncomfortable with her involvement, but John embraced it, treating Yoko as an equal partner in the creative process. Tensions rose. Paul tried to focus on his work. George tried to maintain professionalism, and Ringo observed quietly, understanding that the band's unity was at risk. Yoko's influence extended beyond her physical presence. She introduced John to new art forms, unconventional ideas, and substances that altered his perception and behavior. While some of these experiments were artistic innovations, they disrupted the workflow and created chaos. John's attachment to Yoko shifted the group's dynamic, leading to disagreements, misunderstandings, and resentment. The Beatles were no longer functioning as a cohesive unit. Instead, factions formed, John and Yoko on one side, exploring new creative directions, and Paul, George, and Ringo on the other, trying to maintain the band's original rhythm. What started as personal attachment became a force that fundamentally changed the inner workings of the band. John Lennon's transformation during this period was profound. Influenced by Yoko, he began experimenting with drugs, avant-garde art, and unconventional creative ideas. Ringo noticed John entering the studio with bloodshot eyes, distracted, and often detached from the music-making process. This was not the John Lennon who had shared laughter and spontaneous energy with the group. It was a man absorbed by personal obsession and artistic exploration dictated by Yoko's guidance. Producers like George Martin struggled to maintain control during recording sessions. Arguments became frequent, and John's focus on Yoko's input disrupted the collaborative environment that had previously defined the Beatles' work. Ringo, observing the changes, saw a clear pattern. John's priorities were no longer aligned with the band. Instead, he was guided by emotional attachment and the experimental ideas Yoko introduced. This created a rift between John and the other members. Paul and George tried to maintain order, focusing on musical quality and teamwork, while Ringo quietly observed the increasing strain. Over time, the stress became unbearable. The once harmonious studio environment turned tense, with each member trying to work while navigating personal conflicts, external influence, and the challenges of fame. John's attachment to Yoko had altered not just his behavior, but also the entire creative ecosystem of the Beatles. The unity that had once been the band's greatest strength was now under threat, signaling the beginning of the end of one of history's most iconic musical groups. The tensions escalated when Yoko began entering the Abbey Road studio, violating one of the Beatles' most important unwritten rules: no outsiders during recording. Yoko sat close to John, observing every detail, commenting on creative choices, and even criticizing songs and performances. Paul and George were visibly frustrated. Ringo, always perceptive, felt a deep discomfort as the space became dominated by John and Yoko's partnership. Their presence created an invisible barrier, isolating Paul, George, and even Ringo from the decision-making process. John began treating Yoko as a co-leader of the band, seeking her approval and integrating her feedback into his creative decisions. This intrusion caused friction, leading to arguments over songs, drumming, and even recording schedules. Paul was particularly upset when Yoko criticized his new song, feeling publicly insulted. Ringo tried to lighten the mood with humor, but the tension was undeniable. The once collaborative atmosphere had turned into a battlefield of influence and control. John's emotional attachment to Yoko, combined with her assertiveness, created a situation where the other members felt powerless. The studio, once a sanctuary for musical creation, became a source of stress and conflict. This period marked a crucial turning point in the Beatles' history, demonstrating how personal relationships can influence professional environments, even among the most talented and successful musicians in the world. The growing tension in the studio eventually became too much for Ringo Starr. Known for his calm and diplomatic nature, Ringo had always been a glue that held the band together. He rarely raised his voice and preferred to resolve conflicts quietly. But the constant intrusion, the arguments, and the emotional intensity created by John and Yoko pushed him to his breaking point. During a particularly stressful recording session, Yoko criticized Ringo's drumming, a comment that crossed a line. Ringo had always been proud of his craft, and having an outsider, even one with close relationship to John, critique his work felt like a personal attack. Without a word, Ringo quietly packed his drumsticks and left the studio. His absence created an immediate and palpable void. Paul and George, left to carry on without their drummer, felt the weight of the band's collapse more deeply. The White Album sessions became even more difficult, with Paul and George forced to play drums themselves while trying to manage the creative chaos. Ringo's departure was more than just a loss of a musician. It was a loss of a mediator, a friend, and a stabilizing presence. For John and Yoko, it may have seemed like a minor setback, but for the others, there was a clear indication that the Beatles were no longer functioning as a cohesive unit. Ringo's decision to step away, though painful, highlighted how unbearable the situation had become and set the stage for the band's inevitable breakup. Following Ringo's temporary exit, George Harrison, who had often been the quiet observer, reached his limit. George had always been dedicated to his craft, consistently contributing exceptional songs and guitar work to band. Yet during this period, his creative voice was increasingly overlooked. Yoko's constant presence and John's absorption in her influence made George feel isolated and undervalued. The situation reached a breaking point during a recording session, where George was expected to play multiple instruments, while dealing with John and Yoko's insistence on artistic experiments that had little to do with the song at hand. Frustrated, George finally stood up and declared that he would leave if his work and talent were not respected. His statement shocked Paul and Ringo, who realized that the remaining unity of the Beatles was rapidly disintegrating. George's temporary exit was a significant moment. It marked the collapse of the original balance within the group. The Beatles had always functioned as a unit of four equals, each bringing their unique voice and talent to the table. With George leaving, even temporarily, that balance was gone. The remaining members were forced to confront the reality that the band's golden era of collaboration was over, replaced by personal conflicts, external influences, and the pressures of fame. Amidst the chaos, a brief moment of unity emerged. The famous rooftop performance on January 30th, 1969. The Beatles, despite their personal struggles, came together to perform on the rooftop of Apple Corps' headquarters. It was not an act of inspiration or pure joy. It was a temporary escape, a chance to remind themselves in the world of the magic they could create together. Ringo wrapped his scarf, Paul adjusted his jacket. George silently held a guitar, and John, as usual, had Yoko by his side. For 42 minutes, the band played as if they were the young lads from Liverpool once again, producing music that was raw, passionate, and electrifying. But the rooftop moment was also bittersweet. Everyone knew it was a farewell of sorts. The laughter and camaraderie were temporary, a fragile illusion masking the deep fractures within the group. The cameras captured smiles, but behind those smiles were exhaustion, resentment, and a shared understanding that the Beatles, as they once were, no longer existed. This performance would be remembered as a historic event, not only for its musical brilliance, but also for the emotional context surrounding it. It symbolized both the enduring talent of the Beatles and the painful reality of their personal and professional decline. After the rooftop performance, the Beatles returned to the studio for one final professional effort, the Abbey Road album. Under George Martin's careful guidance, they worked to set aside personal differences and focus on the music. Despite the emotional strain, each member contributed their best work. Paul McCartney's medley sections displayed technical sophistication, John Lennon's compositions carried sharpness and clarity, and George Harrison finally received recognition for two masterpieces. Something in Here Comes the Sun, Ringo returned to the drums, bridging a small gap in a fractured group. Abbey Road became a testament to the Beatles' enduring professionalism and extraordinary talent, even as personal relationships continued to deteriorate. While the album was a musical triumph, it also highlighted the tragic reality. The Beatles were no longer a cohesive unit. They could create brilliance, but only by suppressing the personal and emotional tensions that had grown too large to ignore. Abbey Road stands as both a celebration of their musical genius and a monument to a friendship and collaboration that could not withstand the pressures of fame, love, and external influence. Following Abbey Road, John Lennon made a definitive move. He left the band. With Yoko by his side, John severed ties with the Beatles, stepping away from the pressures of leadership and creative compromise. Management requested discretion to protect financial arrangements, but for John, the band's career was over. Paul McCartney later publicly announced a breakup in April 1970 while promoting his solo album, without consulting the other members. This public declaration angered John, who felt robbed of the historical moment and humiliated. George and Ringo were also stunned by Paul's unilateral decision. The announcement marked the end of not only the Beatles as a band, but also the unity and friendship that had once defined their relationships. What followed was a bitter legal battle to dissolve Apple Corps, with financial and creative control at the center. The four men, once inseparable friends and collaborators, became opponents in court, bound by contracts and resentment rather than shared dreams. This period revealed how personal grievances, external influences, and professional ambitions could intertwine, turning legendary friendships into legal confrontations. For fans, the split was heartbreaking. For the members, it was a painful but unavoidable consequence of complex personal dynamics. After the breakup, tensions continued in public forums. Paul expressed frustration with Yoko Ono, often implying that her influence over John had disrupted the Beatles' creative rhythm. Yoko, in turn, criticized Paul as an artist stuck in the past, unwilling to evolve. Interviews, album covers, and public statements became battlegrounds for airing grievances. John pursued a new creative life with Yoko, exploring art, music, and activism outside the shadow of the Beatles. Paul formed Wings and continued his solo career, navigating both artistic freedom and the lingering frustration of the breakup. George and Ringo focused on individual projects, dealing with the emotional toll of lost friendships and disrupted creative partnerships. For decades, the legacy of the Beatles was not only their music, but also the story of their personal conflicts, particularly the role of Yoko Ono as a catalyst in the band's final years. Fans and historians have debated the fairness of assigning blame, but Ringo's reflections provide a unique insider perspective, emphasizing the profound impact of personal relationships on professional creativity. Despite the heartbreak and conflicts, the Beatles' music endured, inspiring generations and cementing their place as cultural icons. The story of the Beatles' breakup offers valuable lessons about collaboration, loyalty, and the impact of personal relationships. Even the most talented and successful teams can be destabilized when communication, trust, and mutual respect break down. The presence of an outside influence, such as Yoko Ono in the Beatles' case, can magnify underlying tensions and reshape group dynamics. Emotional attachment, personal priorities, and different creative visions must be managed carefully to maintain cohesion in any team, especially one under intense pressure. Ringo Starr's reflections highlight the human side of legendary musicians, the struggles, vulnerabilities, and emotional complexity that accompany fame and success. While the Beatles' end was tragic, it also underscores their resilience and professionalism. They continue to create extraordinary music even amidst personal turmoil, leaving behind an enduring legacy that continues to influence artists and captivate fans worldwide. The story reminds us that behind every celebrated achievement are real people facing challenges, making mistakes, and navigating complexities of relationships and ambition. Today, decades after the Beatles' breakup, the music remains timeless. Songs like Let It Be, Hey Jude, and Something continue to touch hearts, proving that even personal conflict cannot diminish true artistic genius. Ringo Starr, at 84, provides a perspective that combines honesty, insight, and a touch of melancholy. He recounts the impact of Yoko Ono, the changes in John Lennon, and the challenges faced by Paul, George, and himself, illustrating the intricate web of human emotions behind the legendary music. Fans can listen to the Beatles' work and understand both the brilliance of their collaboration and the emotional complexities that eventually led to their dissolution. The band's story is not only about music, but also about friendship, love, influence, and the challenges of maintaining personal and professional balance. Despite the breakup, the Beatles' legacy remains unparalleled, a testament to their enduring talent, creativity, and humanity.